Welcome to Touching Tales, where every story we share is a journey of compassion, courage, and hope. In today's episode, we unravel a gripping tale of a young paramedic's relentless determination to protect an elderly woman from the shadows of betrayal and danger. Stay tuned as we dive into the twists and turns of this heartwarming saga. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our latest stories. Chapter 1. The Unexpected Call. In the serene town of Meadowbrook, where every corner exuded a sense of calm and familiarity, Sam's day began like any other. He was a dedicated paramedic, known for his unwavering commitment to his job and the well-being of the community. As the evening approached, he looked forward to winding down after a long shift filled with routine calls and minor emergencies. Little did he know, the night was about to take a dramatic turn. The radio in his ambulance crackled to life, breaking the tranquil silence. It was Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman he had grown fond of over the years. She was not just a regular caller. She was like family to him. Always polite, with a gentle smile and a kind word, she often called for minor health complaints. But tonight, something was different. Her voice was shaky, barely above a whisper, filled with a fear that sent chills down Sam's spine. "Sam, I don't feel well. Can you please come over?" she murmured, her tone laced with an urgency he had never heard before. Sam's heart raced. Mrs. Thompson was always composed, even in her worst moments. This call felt different, alarming. Without a second thought, he grabbed his gear and headed out into the crisp night air, his mind racing with concern and a sense of impending dread. As he drove through the quiet streets of Meadowbrook, the normally familiar and comforting surroundings felt eerie and foreboding. His thoughts raced back to the times he had visited Mrs. Thompson. She was a strong, independent woman who had lived in the same quaint house for decades. Her porch light was always on, a welcoming beacon that added to the warmth of her home. But tonight, as he approached her house, the light was off, and the silence was deafening. He parked his ambulance and made his way to the front door, every step filled with growing anxiety. "Mrs. Thompson, it's Sam. I'm here," he called softly, knocking gently on the door. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. Mrs. Thompson stood there, looking frail and frightened. Her usually bright eyes were dull, and her hands trembled as she clutched the doorframe. Sam's heart sank. He had never seen her look so vulnerable. "Mrs. Thompson, what happened?" he asked, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. She hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if she expected someone to jump out from the shadows. "It's nothing, Sam. Just an accident," she muttered, her voice barely audible. Sam knew better. His instincts told him that something was terribly wrong. "Please, Mrs. Thompson, let me help. I can call the police if someone's hurt you." Her eyes filled with tears, and she finally relented. "It's my nephew and his friend. They've been staying here, and they've been threatening me, trying to take my money." Sam felt a surge of anger. Vulnerable people like Mrs. Thompson should never have to face such fear. "I'm not leaving you alone. We're going to get you somewhere safe," he said firmly. He helped her gather a few belongings and led her to his car, driving her to a nearby hospital for a thorough checkup. Once she was safe and under medical care, Sam called social services and the police, ensuring they would take immediate action to protect her and deal with the threats. In the days that followed, Sam visited Mrs. Thompson regularly. With the support of the community and legal aid, her nephew and his friend were removed from her home, and she was no longer in danger. Sam and Mrs. Thompson formed a deeper bond, sharing stories and laughter during his visits. One evening, as they sat together, Mrs. Thompson looked at Sam with gratitude in her eyes. "You saved me, Sam. I don't know what I would have done without you." Sam smiled, holding her hand gently. "You don't have to thank me. You're family to me, Mrs. Thompson. I'd do it again in a heartbeat." As time passed, Mrs. Thompson regained her strength and confidence, knowing she was not alone. And for Sam, the experience reaffirmed the power of kindness and compassion. Sometimes, all it takes is one act of kindness to change someone's life forever. Chapter 2. shadows in the night. Sam sat in his small, cluttered apartment, his mind restless with thoughts of Mrs. Thompson. Despite the relief of having her safe for now, the nagging feeling that something more sinister lurked in the shadows wouldn't leave him. He knew he had to stay vigilant, but little did he know, the events of the night were about to escalate. The next morning, Sam made his way to the hospital to check on Mrs. Thompson. As he walked down the sterile, brightly lit corridors, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. When he reached her room, he was greeted by the sight of Mrs. Thompson, looking more relaxed than she had the previous night, but still visibly shaken. "Sam, thank you for coming," she said, her voice still carrying a hint of fear. "I don't know what I would have done without you." "Don't mention it, Mrs. Thompson," Sam replied, taking a seat beside her. "How are you feeling today?" "A bit better," she said, managing a small smile. "The doctors and nurses have been wonderful. But I'm still scared, Sam. My nephew and his friend. They won't give up easily." Sam's brow furrowed with concern. "Don't worry, Mrs. Thompson. I've contacted social services and the police. They're going to make sure you're protected." As they talked, Sam couldn't help but notice the flicker of fear in Mrs. Thompson's eyes whenever someone walked past her room. The trauma of the recent events had clearly taken a toll on her. He knew he had to do more to ensure her safety and peace of mind. Leaving the hospital, Sam's thoughts turned to the mysterious men who had been harassing Mrs. Thompson. He decided to visit her house again to look for any clues that might help the police. When he arrived, the neighborhood was just starting to wake up, with a few early risers already out and about. Sam approached Mrs. Thompson's house cautiously, noticing the front door still slightly ajar. His heart raced as he stepped inside, calling out softly, "Mrs. Thompson? Is anyone here?" The house was eerily silent, and Sam's footsteps echoed through the empty rooms. He moved through the dimly lit hallway, his eyes scanning for any signs of intrusion. Papers were scattered across the small table near the door, overdue bills and prescriptions lying in disarray. The sight deepened his resolve to uncover the truth. As he entered the living room, he noticed a faint light coming from the basement door, which was slightly ajar. Sam's pulse quickened. Gathering his courage, he descended the creaky stairs into the basement, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and remnants of Mrs. Thompson's past. But it wasn't the objects that caught Sam's attention. It was the two sets of muddy footprints leading to a small, makeshift bed in the corner. It was clear someone had been staying here, but they were nowhere to be found now. Sam's mind raced. He had to find out more about these men and their motives. As he turned to leave, something shiny caught his eye. He reached down and picked up a small, silver key. It wasn't like any key he'd seen before, more ornate and ancient-looking. Pocketing the key, he made his way back upstairs, his mind whirling with questions. Back outside, Sam decided to speak with Mrs. Thompson's neighbors again, hoping they might have noticed something unusual. As he approached the first house, an older man answered the door, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "Excuse me, sir," Sam began. "I'm Sam, a paramedic. I've been helping Mrs. Thompson. Have you noticed anything strange around her house recently? Any unfamiliar faces?" The man scratched his head, his expression darkening. "Now that you mention it, I did see two men hanging around her place a few nights ago. They didn't look like they belonged there. I thought about calling the police, but then they left. Haven't seen them since." Sam nodded, his suspicion growing. He thanked the man and moved to the next house. A young woman answered, cradling a steaming mug of tea. She listened attentively as Sam explained the situation. "I did notice something," she said, her voice thoughtful. "A couple of nights ago, I saw two men at her door. They were whispering and knocking, but they seemed off. I thought about checking on her, but I didn't want to intrude." Sam's heart sank. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, and the picture they painted was a troubling one. He moved to the next house, hoping for more answers. An older man greeted him with a grim nod. "I've seen those fellas too," he said, his voice low. "They've been coming around a lot, hanging on her porch and knocking on her door. I told them to get lost, but they didn't seem too happy about it." Sam clenched his fists, his worry transforming into a determination to protect Mrs. Thompson. She had become more than just a regular caller to him, and he couldn't bear the thought of her facing these men alone. He knew he had to do everything in his power to ensure her safety. As he walked back to his car, Sam's mind raced with plans and strategies. He would need to involve the police more directly and make sure Mrs. Thompson's house was secured. And he had to find out more about that key. It felt like a crucial piece of the mystery. Returning to the hospital, Sam found Mrs. Thompson sitting up in bed, looking a bit more relaxed. "Sam, did you find anything?" she asked, her voice hopeful. "I found some clues," he replied, showing her the key. "Do you recognize this?" Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened. That's my husband's key. It opens an old safe we used to keep important documents in." Sam's heart skipped a beat. "Do you know where the safe is?" She nodded, her expression becoming more serious. "It's hidden in the basement, behind the old bookshelf. But I haven't opened it in years." Sam felt a surge of determination. "We need to check it out. There might be something in there that can help us understand what these men are after." As they made plans to retrieve the contents of the safe, Sam couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer to uncovering a deeper, more sinister plot. Whatever was in that safe, it held the key to protecting Mrs. Thompson and bringing those responsible to justice. Chapter 3: Unveiling Secrets. The following day, Sam met Mrs. Thompson back at her house. She was determined to uncover the secrets hidden in the old safe. With a sense of urgency, they headed to the basement, where Mrs. Thompson led Sam to a dusty bookshelf. She moved a few books aside, revealing a hidden panel. With trembling hands, she inserted the ornate key Sam had found, and with a soft click, the safe opened. Inside were stacks of old documents, faded photographs, and a small, leather-bound journal. Mrs. Thompson carefully pulled out the journal, her eyes welling up with tears as she ran her fingers over the worn cover. "This was my husband's," she said softly. "He kept all our important documents and memories in here." Sam gently took the journal from her, flipping through the pages. It was filled with detailed notes and records, documenting their life together. But among the happy memories, Sam found something unexpected: a series of notes about a business deal gone wrong, involving Mrs. Thompson's nephew. "Mrs. Thompson, did you know about this?" Sam asked, his voice tinged with concern. She shook her head, her expression a mix of shock and sadness. "I had no idea. My husband never mentioned any of this to me." As they delved deeper into the journal, it became clear that her nephew had been involved in a shady business deal, which had led to significant financial losses. It appeared he was now trying to recover his losses by exploiting Mrs. Thompson. Sam's resolve hardened. "We need to take this to the police. They need to know what's been happening." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "You're right, Sam. We can't let them get away with this." They gathered the documents and headed to the local police station. Officer Richards, a seasoned detective, listened attentively as they explained the situation and presented the evidence. "This is serious," Officer Richards said, his brow furrowed. "We'll need to investigate this thoroughly. In the meantime, we'll make sure Mrs. Thompson is protected." Feeling a sense of relief, Sam and Mrs. Thompson left the police station, knowing they had taken a crucial step towards justice. But the journey was far from over. They still had to face the men who had threatened her and ensure she remained safe. That evening, Sam returned to his apartment, exhausted but determined. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the men might come after them. He decided to stay at Mrs. Thompson's house for the night, keeping a vigilant watch. As the night wore on, Sam sat by the window, his eyes scanning the darkened street. The hours passed slowly, but just as he was about to drift off, he noticed a shadowy figure lurking near the bushes outside. His heart raced as he quietly grabbed his phone and dialed the police. "Officer Richards, I think they're here," he whispered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Stay inside, Sam." "We're on our way," Officer Richards replied, his voice firm and reassuring. Sam hung up and kept his eyes on the figure, who seemed to be inching closer to the house. His pulse quickened, and he knew he had to act fast to protect Mrs. Thompson. He quietly made his way to her bedroom, gently shaking her awake. "Mrs. Thompson, the police are on their way, but we need to be ready," he whispered urgently. Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened with fear, but she nodded, quickly getting out of bed. They moved to the kitchen, where they could see the front door and the approaching figure. Within minutes, the police arrived, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. The figure froze, then turned to flee, but the officers were quick to apprehend him. It was Mrs. Thompson's nephew, looking desperate and cornered. As they led him away in handcuffs, Officer Richards approached Sam and Mrs. Thompson. "You did the right thing calling us. We'll make sure he faces the consequences." Mrs. Thompson breathed a sigh of relief, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion. "Thank you, Officer Richards. And thank you, Sam. I don't know what I would have done without you." Sam smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. "We're not out of the woods yet, but this is a big step. We'll get through this together." As the night drew to a close, Sam knew that their battle was far from over, but he felt more determined than ever to protect Mrs. Thompson and ensure justice was served. Little did he know, the next few days would bring even greater challenges and revelations. Stay tuned for Chapter 4 as Sam and Mrs. Thompson face new threats and uncover more secrets in their quest for justice. Chapter 4: The Depths of Betrayal. In the days that followed, Sam and Mrs. Thompson tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. But the scars left by the recent events ran deep. Mrs. Thompson's house, once a haven, now felt like a battleground. Sam decided to stay close, keeping a watchful eye on her and ensuring she wasn't left alone. One evening, as they sat in the living room, the warm glow of the fireplace casting comforting shadows, Mrs. Thompson opened up about her family. She revealed more about her late husband's business dealings and the strained relationship with her nephew. "It wasn't always like this," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "My nephew is a good boy, but after his parents died, he changed. I tried to help him, but he started making bad choices." Sam listened intently, understanding that the pain ran deeper than he had imagined. "We'll get through this, Mrs. Thompson. You have people who care about you, and we'll make sure you're safe." As the night wore on, Sam's phone buzzed with a message from Officer Richards. They had found more evidence linking Mrs. Thompson's nephew to a larger criminal operation. It seemed he was involved with a group known for exploiting elderly people. "This is bigger than we thought," Sam said, showing her the message. "But it means we're getting closer to stopping them." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "I just want this nightmare to end." The next day, Sam and Mrs. Thompson met with Officer Richards at the police station. He explained that they were close to making arrests, but they needed Mrs. Thompson's testimony to solidify their case. She agreed, knowing it was the only way to ensure her safety and bring justice to those who had wronged her. As they left the station, a sense of resolve settled over them. They were no longer victims, they were fighting back. But the battle was far from over. Chapter 5: The Final Stand. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and police investigations. Mrs. Thompson's courage in testifying against her nephew and his associates was a turning point in the case. With the support of Sam and the community, she found the strength to face her fears head-on. On the day of the final hearing, the courtroom was filled with tension. Mrs. Thompson stood at the witness stand, her voice steady as she recounted the threats and harassment she had endured. Sam sat in the audience, his heart swelling with pride at her bravery. When the verdict was finally delivered, it was a victory. The men responsible were sentenced to prison, and Mrs. Thompson was granted the legal protection she needed to ensure her safety. As they left the courthouse, Sam and Mrs. Thompson were greeted by a small crowd of neighbors and friends who had come to support them. It was a moment of triumph, a testament to the strength of community and the power of standing up for what is right. Over the following months, life began to return to normal. Mrs. Thompson's house was no longer a place of fear, but a home once more. Sam continued to visit regularly, their bond stronger than ever. One evening, as they sat together enjoying a meal, Mrs. Thompson looked at Sam with tears in her eyes. "You saved me, Sam. I don't know what I would have done without you. Sam smiled, taking her hand gently. You've been like family to me, Mrs. Thompson. I'm just glad I could help. With the shadows of the past behind them, they looked forward to a future filled with hope and kindness, knowing that together, they could face anything. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If you were moved by this story, please give us a thumbs up and share it with your friends and family. We'd love to hear your thoughts and where you're watching from in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe to Touching Tales and click the notification bell so you're always updated with our newest stories. Remember, sometimes all it takes is a single act of kindness to change someone's life forever. Until next time, stay kind and take care.